So, steps of mucus addiction. So now we're getting into some of the stages or steps of addiction. So, stage one, initial use. So this is from being a baby, and it would be one thing if, now there are a handful of children now that have been born into the mucusless diet that have never tasted meat, that have never tasted dairy products. Brother Ayer's son Hanif is in that category of a mucusless diet baby. So that is the birth of a new generation. That's the birth of a new reality. So that would even be a whole different, that would have to be a different PowerPoint presentation when we start talking about people that are born into a mucusless diet household. But for most of us, we might have breastfed, but we also probably had the formula. And I almost I should have added that, but maybe I'll throw a picture up of it now. Look at all these ingredients. This is the common formula. Now, for folks that have had mucusless diet babies, they have told me that it was fairly easy to create things for the baby to drink and eat. Breastfed for as long as possible, and then start getting into eating a little bit of fruit, making some making your own formula, maybe using a little nut milk here and there to, a little bit of, because what does the mucus do? The mucus actually slows down the elimination for the baby. That's what breast milk does. That's what the formula does. That's what the eating does. It slows down the elimination of pus and mucus so that the baby don't end up drowning in its own waste, in its own mucus, in its system, and so to feed a baby that which is going to transition it properly, it's the same principles. That's why in order to have a child on the mucusless diet, you better be on the mucusless diet, and you better be a master of the transition, or as far along as you can be, because that is naturally going to extend down to your children if you're brave enough. Because then there's some people that they get scared when it comes to the kids, and again, that's another PowerPoint presentation. But so the initial use, and that's the thing, we based on our, I look at it as physiological karma. We're born into situations where we don't have a choice. We're gonna be eating this stuff, and so I don't blame nobody. You don't blame the family. You don't blame yourself or nothing. You're just, this is the reality in which we've created, or in which we've been dealt, depending on your philosophical outlook on life. But so stage two, early stage of dependency. Bet we know who this is. That's that's me with the turkey leg. Yeah. So by the time you have been transitioned, like literally transitioned into pus and mucus eating by way of, because babies, start out liquidarian. That's something else I could have mentioned, from very fundamentally like liquidarian. Actually, fundamentally, breath is totally fundamental. It's the first thing they do. But then liquidarian, they start eating, purees and mashed up type of stuff, and then actually transitioned into pus and mucus to the point where it doesn't harm them initially. Even though there's a lot of children that go through a lot of illnesses, and even in my case, I had terrible ear constipation problems, and so they had to put tubes in my ears to drain the mucus, and always had a lot of issues like that. I was sick a lot, and so it affected me, but it didn't affect me the minute I was eating the foods. And so that becomes this, it's almost this deficiency in the human understanding of illness, is that we don't put that two and two together, that just because you're not going to immediately get sick right after you eat something bad, because we've grown a tolerance to it. and look at how, and that's why the understanding the transition is so fundamental. Look at how, I have to say the word eloquently. I hate to, but we're transitioned eloquently into pus and mucus. So why wouldn't we want to transition ourselves eloquently back to being mucus free, back into liquidarian levels? You know, I mean, the transition from being a baby into pus and mucus eating is very gradual. It's slow, and it's, you know, it's something that is it's interesting to think of that. So for us to think that we can just in a 30-day or couple years we can totally transition off of pus and mucus, that's just not being logical in understanding the depth of what we're actually dealing with. So early stage dependency, I just give that, you know, sort of childhood time period. Then stage 3, middle stage of dependency, I sort of applied that to adolescence and early adulthood. And, you know, culturally speaking, some of this is sort of geared toward the West. I know more. I experienced, you know, growing up in America, in the United States, and so I sort of have went through that socialization process. And a big part of that socialization process is high school to college. There's this whole eating, this, you know, everything's revolving around eating, and the whole social hookup revolves around eating or other, you know, substance abuse is real hand in hand. But at college, there's this epidemic of folks go off to college and then they gain, they used to call it the freshman 15, but I gained like 20 or 25 pounds. I've seen a lot of other people gain even more than that. Literally, that freshman year, they lose it. They lose it that freshman year and blow up and get huge. And that's a thing. So I just look at that as such a benchmark. By that point, the dependency is just normalized. It is ingrained. And so I look, you know, just in its stage or steps, whichever one you want to look to use, there's this process. Another thing about that is, again, within the culture of the United States or the Western cultures, there is this idea of you become an adult at a particular age, like legally. At age 18, you are, you know, young adult. At age 21, there's more privileges that you're afforded that you couldn't have because you were too young before. You know, so we have these sort of benchmarks that go along with school, graduation of high school, graduation of college. You know, it's sort of, and so a lot of that is socially constructed, but it does tend to go with physiological and psychological development. And I don't get way too off in the weeds of that, but my point is that by this point, a lot of people are making their own decisions. You know, they're not necessarily just eating what their family is making them eat or what the whole family is eating. They might be on their own. They might have moved away, and now it's on them. And so in my case, I ate 10 times worse when I was on my own. So I had that type of autonomy, and I had that kind of access to food because the you know, call it college dorm and college life. You know, there's a lot of cheap food all over the place, and of course that cheap food is not going to be the greatest food. But when you get into this, what's a more of a gluttonous, you know, the ability to be even more gluttonous, that just deepens the dependency, makes things even harder and harder later on when you want to get off of it. So, and that's something to keep in mind when we start talking about remedy for these stages, is just to put everything into perspective. So then we got this stage 4 crisis stage of dependency. So this is, there's a lot of obesity epidemic over here in the United States, and it's spreading all around the world because fast food's going everywhere. Island nations that where people used to have mostly a plant-based diet with maybe just a little meat and they weren't gluttonous. Now they got KFC. My dad's from Trinidad, and I've talked to him about that, and it's like, yeah, now there's KFC down there and Pizza Hut and McDonald's and all that kind of stuff. And that's actually going to be really devastating on people with island physiologies, because they probably didn't transition into pus and mucus eating, so they're not going to be able to really function very well without the transition. The one thing about being in a Western type of situation is your bloodline probably transitioned into pus and mucus eating over a longer period of time. Sometime I'll talk more about that, because that gets sort of interesting particularly with people of African descent. That when you look at the history of slavery and the diet of the rapid change of a forced alien diet, that's creates some interesting things. But anyway, so crisis stage of dependency. I mean, these pictures sort of speak for themselves. It's just all vitality is lost. Illness becomes rampant. The aging process just becomes inevitable. It's just something that can definitely be dealt with. It can be dealt with. It can be dealt with, and it's better to deal with it sooner than later. And I'll say one more thing about it, and some people will say, well, that's just normal. That's the natural evolution. That's the natural aging process. And I respectfully disagree with that perspective, that we are meant to age so ungracefully, that we are meant to live with so little dignity. Even when you go to indigenous peoples that might not be mucusless, but have a far better eating habit than we have. A lot of them live a lot longer, and a lot of them, their elders sort of have a more dignity to them. They can still get around. They can still, they don't look so they're in so much pain. They're not suffering as much. And then when they actually pass, there wasn't this real crazy kind of chronic illness and all the symptoms that go along with it. It was a different experience, a different thing. And so for me, this type of aging process is not normal, is not natural at all. Okay, to end our discussion of the steps of mucus addiction, or the stages of mucus addiction, just wanted to reiterate that this is not meant to be some kind of catch-all steps or stages. These are going to differ depending on cultural background, ecology. They will definitely shift as people begin to change, and you start to see more and more generations of people growing up mucusless or growing up on these healing plant-based diets. So this is just an overall observation that I know many of you will relate to, and take it for what it's worth from that perspective. Just basically, instead of another thing to think about when we get to the recovery section is understanding these various stages of mucus addiction will sort of give you a perspective of how hard you have to work when you get into the diet. If you're beginning the diet when you're 7 years old, you're going to have a much different experience than if you begin the diet when you're 18 years old, or if you begin the diet when you're 15 years old, or if you begin the diet when you're 70 years old. have to put all of that into perspective. You're going to have very different experience. The nature of your transition is going to be a little different. So age is a factor of great consideration when you're talking about the transition diet and the mucusless diet healing system.